It's late. You found your spot, maybe under a blanket, maybe with your head resting just so, and the world outside has grown quiet. That's when the imagination is at its most unruly. It starts whispering, what if the North Pole was not just a frozen desert of shifting ice, but a doorway? Not to a research station, not to another snowstorm, but to something you've never been told exists. A lost world, warm, verdant, hidden beneath the ice cap, perhaps even inhabited. Before we go any further, let me say, you don't have to believe any of this. In fact, it might be better if you don't. I'm only here to tell you stories, some stitched from history, others from rumour, and some balanced delicately between the two. But you will hear about real explorers, real anomalies, and real debates, and then it will be up to you whether you want to keep the door closed or take a step through. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here, and I'd like to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. Let's begin with a curious figure, Admiral Richard E. Byrd, decorated US naval officer, polar explorer, and, depending on which books you read, one of the first modern witnesses to an uncharted land inside the Arctic. In 1947, Byrd allegedly flew beyond the pole and saw lush green valleys, rivers, and even large animals not known to the Arctic. According to certain fringe accounts, which mainstream historians politely categorize as unverified, Byrd's plane was drawn into this hidden realm, where he spoke with an advanced civilization. There are no official records confirming such an event, and the flight logs in question have a way of disappearing or reappearing, depending on which archivist you ask. Now, the authoritative historical fact. Byrd did indeed lead several expeditions into polar regions, and he logged more flight hours over the Arctic than nearly anyone else in his time. His navigational notes, the verified ones, confirm he encountered unusual weather patterns, abrupt temperature shifts, and optical illusions so severe that horizon lines bent in ways impossible to explain to pilots who'd never flown so far north. Here's an odd but true detour. In the same decade, a team of Soviet researchers claimed to have lost radio contact with an Arctic flight for over 14 minutes, only for the signal to return with the crew swearing they'd been out of time. The Soviet report, at least the publicly available version, chalks this up to atmospheric interference. Still, it's the sort of thing that makes you wonder if unusual distortions near the pole are stranger than textbooks let on. Hypothesis time. What if the Arctic ice is not a continuous solid mass, but punctuated by geothermal vents and cavern systems large enough to maintain microclimates? Some geologists argue this is plausible. After all, volcanic islands like Jan Mayen exist in polar latitudes, their snow-capped peaks hiding lava-heated slopes. A network of such vents beneath the ice might form hidden valleys. Whether such valleys exist is, as you might guess, a matter historians and scientists are still debating. Picture it. An explorer crests a ridge of snow, blinded by the white glare, and there below is a ribbon of emerald, steaming faintly, where warm rivers cut through grass that hasn't felt frost in centuries. Whether such a sight is possible at the pole is uncertain. What is certain is that the human mind is irresistibly drawn to fill the blank spaces on the map with something more interesting than yet another snowdrift. And the North Pole, for centuries, has been the largest blank space of them all. Imagine you're in a dimly lit archive, the kind where the air smells faintly of dust, and the pages of the books have that fragile, almost buttery texture of something touched by hundreds of years of careful hands. You pull a flat leather portfolio from a shelf, slide it open, and there it is, a map. But not the sort you'd buy at a souvenir shop or see pinned in a school classroom. This one is clearly older. The paper is thick, almost cloth-like. The ink, once black, has shifted to a warm brown, and along the edges you see ornate flourishes, compass roses, sailing ships, the curling forms of sea creatures. And then your eyes drift north, far north, to the top of the world. You expect to see what most modern maps show, the familiar white nothingness of the Arctic ice cap. But here, there's something else. A network of rivers, islands, maybe even mountains carefully shaded. It's not labelled North Pole, because at the time the cartographer drew it, that phrase wouldn't have meant much. Instead, the area is given a curious name in a script so elaborate it's difficult to read. The fact that this land is drawn at all is startling, because no explorer of that era had been there to see it. This is the kind of enigma wrapped inside the Piri-Reis map and others like it. The authoritative fact is that the Piri-Reis map is real and dates to 1513. It was created by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis, who compiled it using charts from his contemporaries and, more intriguingly, older source maps, some of which he claimed dated back to antiquity. His own notes mention maps from the time of Alexander, raising questions about what knowledge might have survived from the ancient world into the Renaissance. The more you look at this problem, the stranger it gets. A handful of scholars have suggested that some early maps appear to show polar coastlines without ice. That is geologically accurate, but only for periods thousands of years before the present, when Earth's axial tilt, climate and glacial coverage were different. How could a 16th century admiral have such information? Either it's coincidence, an extraordinary stroke of guesswork, or he had access to sources that preserved pre-glacial geography. Now, here's an odd but true tangent. In the margins of many early maps, especially from the 15th and 16th centuries, you'll often find fantastical beasts. Sea serpents curling through waves, giant fish with castle-like spines, or whales with the heads of lions. These weren't just idle doodles. Some were based on sailors' tales, others on misunderstood sightings of real animals, and a few may have been symbolic warnings of treacherous waters. In a world where vast swathes of the globe were still unmapped, imagination filled the gaps, and the boundary between fact and embellishment was thin. It's worth pausing to consider how these maps were made. Early cartographers didn't have satellites, aerial photography, or GPS. They worked from sailors' logs, astronomical measurements, dead reckoning, and whatever scraps of older charts they could obtain, sometimes by trade, sometimes by theft, and sometimes by the quiet diplomacy of scholars exchanging knowledge across cultures. The Ottoman Empire, sitting at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa, was in a unique position to collect geographic information from many sources, including some that Western Europe had lost during the Middle Ages. But the deeper mystery here isn't just about how maps were made, it's about why certain details appear where they shouldn't. For example, some early polar depictions include 4 islands arranged around a central sea, a motif that shows up in both medieval European maps and older Islamic geographic works. Could this be a symbolic representation of the magnetic pole, or is it an inherited fragment of some lost survey? Historians are still debating whether this repeated imagery is purely mythical or based on a distorted memory of real geography. Hypothesis time. What if there really was a repository of ancient cartographic data, perhaps kept in a city like Alexandria before its library was destroyed, or in some other, lesser-known archive? Such a collection could have been copied, translated and handed down quietly for centuries. By the time it reached Piri Reis or his contemporaries, the origins might have been long forgotten, leaving only the maps themselves, stripped of their context but still bearing accurate geographic outlines. Some fringe theorists go further, suggesting that ancient seafaring cultures may have reached the poles in ice-free eras, mapping coastlines now buried under glaciers. Mainstream science doesn't support the idea of a global civilization that far back, but it's not hard to find examples of ancient peoples achieving surprising feats of navigation. The Polynesians crossing the Pacific using only the stars, the Norse sailing to North America centuries before Columbus, or the Phoenicians circumnavigating Africa. If these groups could traverse such distances, the possibility, however remote, of pre-glacial polar mapping becomes more tantalizing. Let's take a moment for a sensory exercise. Imagine you are a sailor in the late 1400s, on the deck of a creaking ship, the wind biting through layers of wool and leather. You've been at sea for weeks, following a heading whispered to you by an old navigator who claims to have seen something unusual far to the north. As you press into colder waters, strange phenomena occur. The sky glows faintly at night, the compass needle twitches without cause, and the sea seems to swirl in patterns that don't match the wind. You keep a rough sketch of your course, noting the shapes of coasts and islands as you think you see them, though sometimes they shimmer and vanish, perhaps mirages caused by the Arctic air. Later in port, a cartographer takes your notes and integrates them into a larger map. Over decades, and through many such voyages, a composite image emerges, one that may not be entirely accurate, but not entirely fictional either. And here's another curious thread. Certain indigenous oral histories from the Arctic speak of lands beyond the ice, reachable only by a long journey under strange skies. In some versions, these are realms of spirits. In others, they are simply warmer lands where animals and plants flourish. While these stories can be read metaphorically, they also hint at the possibility that navigable passages may have existed in the past, whether seasonally or during climate shifts. Could ancient mariners have heard such tales and set out to find these places, later inspiring the maps that perplex us today? Critics will say that all of this is romantic nonsense, that early map makers were prone to errors, that ice-free depictions were just filler to occupy blank spaces, and that humans are wired to find patterns where none exist. And perhaps they are right. But there's a counterpoint. The remarkable thing about history is that sometimes the most outlandish stories turn out to be based on a grain of truth. The question is whether these maps are one of those cases. So you're left with the image of that old parchment spread across a table, candlelight flickering on its surface. A finger traces the outline of an unknown land at the top, a place the mapmaker never saw but felt compelled to include. Whether it's a memory of a forgotten age or just an embellishment to make the world feel more mysterious, that's something you'll have to decide for yourself. The map fades from view, but the idea it planted doesn't leave you. Land where there should be none. Warmth where the world is meant to be locked in ice. You start thinking about how far such ideas can go when someone decides they're not just mistakes, but clues. And that's when we drift into the strange territory of Hollow Earth theories. Today, the phrase Hollow Earth sounds like the premise of a pulp adventure novel, and in fairness, it is. But for a surprisingly long stretch of history, some very serious people entertained the possibility. This wasn't because they were naive, but because science, as they knew it, left room for such possibilities. Let's start with the authoritative fact. In 1692, the English astronomer Edmund Halley, yes, the Halley of Halley's Comet, proposed a model of the Earth composed of concentric spheres, each with its own magnetic field, separated by layers of atmosphere. His reasoning? To explain anomalies in compass readings that standard models couldn't. Halley even suggested that the inner shells might be inhabited and illuminated by a subtle form of light. To modern ears, it sounds almost whimsical. But you have to remember, Halley lived in a time before seismology, before we could measure the Earth's density with precision. The idea that the planet could have vast empty spaces inside it was not inherently ridiculous. Even today, scientists talk about voids within the Earth's crust and mantle, not habitable ones, but large, low-density regions. Halley just took the concept further than modern geology allows. The odd fact here comes from a century later, when an American Army officer named John Cleves Sims Jr. became convinced that not only was the Earth hollow, but that there were large openings at both poles leading inside. In 1818, he sent circulars to every major government in the world, calling for an expedition to prove his theory. His proposal was met with polite amusement, but he became a minor celebrity, touring the country giving lectures. Sims was so committed that he wanted to lead the journey himself. He died before such an expedition was funded, but his followers kept the idea alive, publishing pamphlets that described lush inner continents lit by a central sun. Hypothesis time. If we strip away the most fantastical elements, could Sims' polar openings have been inspired by something real? One possibility is that travellers returning from high latitudes reported seeing vast mirages or breaks in the ice, optical illusions that could make it seem like a passage stretched endlessly inward. Another possibility is more geological. The Arctic is home to recurring polynyas, areas of open water surrounded by ice, some of which remain unfrozen year-round due to upwelling warm currents. A sailor stumbling upon one might easily imagine it as the threshold to somewhere warmer, stranger, and very far from the world they knew. Historians are still debating whether Hollow Earth theory emerged purely from scientific curiosity, or whether it was always driven by the human love for hidden worlds, the same instinct that fills fairy tales with underground kingdoms and rivers of fire. That instinct runs deep. The Norse spoke of Svartalfaheim, the realm of the dwarves, reached by deep tunnels. The Greeks told of Hades beneath the earth. Siberian myths speak of tribes who fled underground to escape a great catastrophe. Sims might have been building on a foundation of ancient ideas without realizing it. Picture the 19th century lecture halls where these ideas were shared. You'd have gaslight flickering against high plaster walls, a crowd in heavy coats and stiff collars, the air smelling faintly of damp wool and pipe smoke. At the front, Sims or one of his supporters would stand beside a large globe, explaining how the poles were not caps of solid ice but doorways, and that through them lay a habitable paradise untouched by the storms and struggles of the outer world. In an age before Antarctica had been fully explored and before aerial photography existed, it wasn't impossible to believe. Let's pause for an odd but telling detour. In 1838, the United States launched the Wilkes expedition, officially to explore the Pacific and parts of the Antarctic. One of its ships, the USS Peacock, became trapped in ice off the coast of what's now Wilkes Land. Though the expedition made valuable scientific contributions, rumours spread that the crew had glimpsed something inland, not just mountains, but vast green valleys. This was never confirmed, and most historians dismiss it as a distortion of the actual landscape. Still, it's the kind of report that feeds into larger myths, because once people hear about a green place in a white desert, it's hard to stop imagining it. There's also the problem, or maybe the gift, of human perception in extreme environments. The Arctic and Antarctic are notorious for distorting what the eye sees. Temperature inversions can create mirages that flip the sky and the ground, magnify distant objects, or conjure entire phantom coastlines. If a 19th century expedition saw such an effect, they might record it in their journals as a genuine sighting, not knowing the physics behind it. A mirage of a distant open sea could become, in the telling, a glimpse into a hidden inner world. Modern science, of course, has closed the door on the literal Hollow Earth. Seismic readings from earthquakes, for example, show that the planet has a solid inner core and a molten outer core, with no vast empty spaces for civilizations to inhabit. But rejecting the literal doesn't make the metaphor disappear. For many people, the Hollow Earth remains a powerful symbol of mystery, of the possibility that the surface we walk on isn't all there is. Let's test a thought experiment. What if, instead of an entirely hollow planet, there were vast underground cave systems, not connected in a globe-spanning inner world, but large enough to support isolated ecosystems? We know such places exist on smaller scales. The Movel Cave in Romania has been cut off from the surface for millions of years, hosting life forms found nowhere else. In Vietnam, Son Jong Cave is so large it has its own weather system. Scale these up, place them under polar ice, and suddenly Sim's dream doesn't feel completely impossible, just improbable. And improbability has never stopped the human mind from wandering there. You can almost hear the creak of a wooden ship pressing into unknown waters, the crunch of ice against the hull, the muffled conversations below deck about what might lie ahead. Somewhere in those conversations, perhaps, is the voice of someone like Sims, insisting that if you sail far enough north, you'll find an opening, and if you're brave enough to go through, you'll see a light that doesn't come from the sun. Maybe it's only a story. Maybe it's the echo of older tales, retold until they became speculation disguised as science. Or maybe, and this is the thought that keeps you awake a little longer, every myth starts somewhere. You're still thinking about those imagined polar openings when another image intrudes, not of ice or water, but of sky. Because if the Arctic has a signature, it isn't just the endless white, it's the aurora. Those shimmering curtains of green, red and violet that seem to fall from nowhere. If the Hollow Earth theories needed a visual metaphor, they could hardly do better than the Northern Lights. A veil that glows and shifts, as if hiding something beyond. For millennia, people who lived under those skies have tried to explain them. The Inuit of Canada and Greenland have more than one story. In some versions, the aurora is the dance of the spirits of the dead, playing with a walrus skull as a kind of celestial ball game. In others, the lights are the flicker of torches carried by ancestors guiding the newly dead to the afterlife. The Sami people of northern Scandinavia traditionally saw the aurora as dangerous, a sign to keep your head low and your voice down, lest you attract its attention. The authoritative historical fact here is that the scientific explanation for auroras only became clear in the 20th century. We now know they are caused by charged particles from the sun colliding with Earth's magnetic field and upper atmosphere, creating light emissions. The green is oxygen at about 100 kilometers up, red comes from oxygen higher still, and blue or purple from nitrogen. But for most of history, these shifting lights were mysteries that demanded meaning. Here's an odd detour. In 1938, the aurora was visible as far south as Scotland, the Alps, and parts of mainland Europe. In some towns, people thought a fire was consuming the horizon. In others, church bells rang to signal an unknown emergency. And in at least one documented case, an entire village gathered on a hillside to watch, convinced that it was the end of the world. The polar lights can inspire awe, but when they appear out of place, they can unsettle even the most rational mind. Hypothesis time. What if the aurora, in addition to its natural causes, had once been used as a kind of celestial landmark? Indigenous navigation in the Arctic relies on many cues: the stars, the winds, the lay of the land. But auroras tend to appear in certain bands of latitude, especially during heightened solar activity. Could these lights have been seen as the glowing gate to a special place, perhaps the fabled warm lands beyond the ice? If you were travelling on foot or by sled across featureless white, the sudden rise of coloured sky could feel like a sign you were close to something extraordinary. Historians are still debating whether these myths are purely symbolic or whether they encode practical knowledge, like seasonal patterns, migration cues, or even distant geographic features. Some anthropologists argue that myth and survival knowledge are often inseparable in oral traditions. To tell a story about lights guiding the dead might also be a way of marking the path to certain hunting grounds, or warning of changes in the weather. Imagine the scene. You're an Arctic hunter centuries ago, bundled in caribou skins, crossing the frozen sea with your sled dogs. The night is so cold it feels like the air itself might shatter. Then, from the northern horizon, a green light unfurls upward, then sideways, then all across the sky. It ripples like silk in slow motion. The dogs hesitate, sensing your pause. You've seen this before, but rarely so bright. The elders say it means the spirits are restless, or that a shift in the season is coming. You don't know if that's true, but you keep moving, because the lights also mean something else. The world is never as still or as empty as it appears. It's not just Arctic cultures who've woven the aurora into their cosmologies. In medieval Europe, they were sometimes seen as omens of war or plague, a bloody sky foretelling a bloody year. In China's Tang dynasty, court astronomers recorded them as celestial vapours and debated their meaning. Across the world, when the sky misbehaves, people notice, and in the far north, it misbehaves often. There's a subtle connection here to the lost world idea. Light, in most myths, is both revelation and concealment. The aurora doesn't just illuminate, it changes the shape of the darkness behind it, hides stars, makes the world feel layered. In the same way, legends about hidden polar realms are often about something existing just beyond perception, masked not by distance, but by a kind of shimmering threshold. You can see it, but you can't touch it. Not yet. And then there's the practical effect. Auroras can disrupt navigation by interfering with magnetic compasses and radio signals. This is more than a curiosity. It has caused real issues for Arctic expeditions and even military operations. If your compass starts swinging unpredictably under a glowing sky, it's not hard to imagine how a 19th century explorer might conclude that something beyond the lights was causing it. Let's entertain a more speculative possibility. What if ancient travellers considered the aurora a sort of marker of a geographic phenomenon, maybe geothermal vents, maybe atmospheric corridors, and passed this down in story form? If the veil of light marked the region near a polar opening, it would be remembered in ways that outlived the scientific understanding of the cause. The lights would not just be beautiful, they would be directional. We can tie this back to something we touched on earlier, the human need to animate landscapes. A white desert of ice is intimidating. A white desert of ice under a flickering sky feels inhabited, alive, maybe even watchful. When the aurora appears, it's easy to feel that the land is showing you something, and if you're willing to believe the land can keep secrets, then maybe it's also willing to hint at them. In the end, whether you see the northern lights as a scientific marvel, a spiritual phenomenon, or a gateway to something hidden, they occupy a unique place in Arctic life. They're a reminder that even in the most remote, frozen and seemingly lifeless corners of the earth, beauty can bloom suddenly and without explanation. And beauty, like mystery, is often an invitation to imagine, to wonder, and perhaps to search for a place that may or may not exist. So as the last ripple of green fades into the deep polar night, you're left with the impression of a curtain drawn closed. Behind it, something waits, or maybe it's nothing at all, and you can't help thinking both possibilities are equally haunting. The lights fade from the sky, the ice hardens under your boots, and the world returns to its deep, echoing silence. But now the mind drifts to another question. Who else has come here and never left? The polar regions are littered with stories of expeditions that set out with hope and determination, only to vanish into white oblivion. The authoritative fact to start with, one of the most famous of these is the Franklin expedition of 1845. Two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, under the command of Sir John Franklin, sailed from England in search of the Northwest Passage, a fabled sea route linking the Atlantic and Pacific through Arctic waters. The expedition was well equipped for its time, with steam engines, tinned food, and enough supplies for 3 years. Yet both ships disappeared. For decades, the only clues were scattered artifacts and haunting Inuit testimonies of starving men wandering the ice. It wasn't until 2014 and 2016 that the wrecks of Erebus and Terror were finally located, preserved in the frigid water near King William Island. Modern archaeology suggests that a combination of ice entrapment, lead poisoning from poorly soldered tins, disease and exposure doomed the crew. But some details resist explanation, like why both ships ended up far from where searchers expected, or why some crew members seem to have abandoned them while they were still intact. Here's an odd detour into Arctic exploration lore. In 1913, the Canadian Arctic expedition lost the ship Karluk after it became trapped in ice. Stranded survivors told of a mirage that appeared on the horizon, not of land, but of what looked like green hills under a strange light. They knew it was impossible, yet some swore they could smell vegetation. Was it an optical illusion? A trick of exhaustion and cold? Or, in the language of those drawn to the polar mysteries, a glimpse of somewhere they weren't meant to go? Hypothesis time. Could some vanished expeditions have stumbled upon transient ice-free zones, perhaps geothermal oases, and disappeared simply because no one else could find those same conditions again? We know that volcanic islands like Iceland and Jan Mayen exist at high latitudes, warmed by geothermal activity. It's conceivable that smaller, less-known vents could occasionally create habitable pockets even within the Arctic Circle. If an expedition reached such a place, they might shelter there, and if something went wrong, their remains might never be found because the shifting ice later erased the location entirely. Historians are still debating whether such oases have existed within the historical period. While satellite data shows some recurring polynyas and open water regions in the Arctic, there's no confirmed evidence of temperate valleys hidden under the ice today. But absence of evidence is not, as the saying goes, evidence of absence, particularly in a region where the landscape changes constantly, and visibility can be measured in meters. The Franklin expedition wasn't the first or the last mystery. In 1848, the USS Advance and Rescue went searching for Franklin and were themselves trapped for over a year, their crew surviving on dwindling supplies and the generosity of Inuit hunters. In 1881, the USS Jeannette sank after being crushed by ice north of Siberia. The survivors attempted to trek to land, but most perished. One diary recovered years later contained a puzzling note: "Sky lit from beyond, warmth on the wind." It was written in June, when some thawing was possible, but warmth on the wind from the north is still unusual enough to raise eyebrows. Let's pause for a moment and imagine what it's like to be in that situation. You're part of a crew locked in ice for months. The cold is constant, the sun gone for half the year, your food is dwindling, the ship groans under the pressure of shifting flows, and your breath hangs in the air like a ghost that refuses to leave. Then, one day, a lookout shouts. He sees something in the distance. It might be land. It might even be open water. Desperation can make a man believe in impossible things, and so you pack up, head toward it, and never return. An odd fact to keep in mind. Even in the 20th century, polar flights have reported strange phenomena that sound almost supernatural. In 1962, a US Air Force C-135 reconnaissance plane flying over the high Arctic encountered an area where instruments behaved erratically, and the outside air temperature rose by nearly 10 degrees Celsius over the course of minutes. The official explanation was an unusual warm air mass, rare but meteorologically possible. Still, it's hard not to think of those vanished expeditions when you read accounts like that. And then there's the 1909 Peary-Cook controversy. Both Frederick Cook and Robert Peary claim to have reached the North Pole that year, but their records are disputed. Some historians suspect neither actually made it to the precise geographic pole, but in Cook's account he described an ice-free polar sea, an idea instantly dismissed by most scientists. Could Cook have encountered an unusual polynya and simply extrapolated too far? Or was he, knowingly or not, brushing against the edge of the gateway that legends place at the pole? Disappearances breed speculation, and speculation breeds myth. Inuit oral history speaks of ships that vanished into fog and never returned, sometimes accompanied by the sound of distant drums or singing. In these stories, the lost are not dead, they have simply gone somewhere else. This is an idea that maps perfectly onto the vision of a hidden inner world. In the narrative of the Arctic as a threshold, these disappearances are not tragedies but transitions. Let's consider one more hypothesis, one less supernatural but no less strange. The Arctic ice pack is in constant motion. Objects left in one location can drift hundreds of kilometers over months or years, carried by currents and wind. An expedition camp could, in theory, end up thousands of kilometers from where it started, making later searches futile. This drifting ice has even transported artifacts. Inuit hunters have found European objects far from any recorded contact, carried invisibly across the top of the world. If a small boat or group of explorers vanished this way, their trail would dissolve into nothing. In the end, the vanished expeditions are like the aurora. You can see their outline, but never touch the reality behind it. The ships, the men, the journals, all frozen in place, then scattered by forces bigger than any human plan. Some of their stories have been pieced together, others remain forever in the realm of speculation, And when you add the possibility, however faint, that a few may have found something extraordinary, the silence of the Arctic starts to sound less like emptiness and more like secrecy. So you move on, deeper into the white, carrying the thought that not every path across this ice leads back. The Arctic has a way of lulling you into thinking it's uniform, a single, endless sheet of cold. But spend enough time up here, and you begin to notice it's not so simple. The ice shifts, the sky changes, and sometimes the water itself breaks the rules. Authoritative fact first. Oceanographers have long known about warm currents flowing into the Arctic Ocean. The Gulf Stream, after travelling north along the eastern coast of North America, splits into branches. One of them, the North Atlantic, drift, carries relatively warm, salty water toward Europe and eventually into the Arctic basin. This water can be several degrees above freezing, enough to influence sea ice formation and melting patterns. The odd fact is how far these warm waters can sometimes penetrate. In certain conditions, they slip beneath the colder, fresher surface layer and travel hundreds of kilometres under the ice before gradually mixing upward. This means that deep in the frozen north, where you'd expect the sea to be as cold as the surrounding air, there are pockets of warmth moving silently below. Imagine being an early explorer, expecting nothing but freezing water, and suddenly finding an area of open sea surrounded by ice. In the 19th century, such places were called polynyas. Some are seasonal, appearing each year in roughly the same locations due to wind patterns and currents. Others are transient, opening unpredictably in the middle of the ice pack. Even now, satellites sometimes detect them in surprising locations, vast dark patches in the white sheet. Hypothesis time. Could such open water zones have been mistaken for entrances to another world? It's not such a leap. To someone travelling over ice for weeks, stumbling upon a polynya large enough to lose the horizon could feel like stepping into a different climate altogether. If the air was warmer, if seabirds were present, if fish leapt in the dark water, the contrast to the surrounding wasteland would be stark enough to inspire legends. Historians are still debating how significant these warm water anomalies were to past exploration. Some argue they were simply curiosities noted in ship logs. Others suggest they played a major role in both survival and disaster. A ship trapped in ice could find salvation in drifting into a polynya, or disaster if the open water allowed shifting flows to crush the hull more easily. Let's step into the role of a sailor on such a journey. The ice around your vessel has been locked for months. The hull is groaning under the pressure, the deck coated with frost so thick it crunches underfoot. And then, one morning, you emerge to find the horizon changed. Instead of endless white, there's a black expanse of rippling water stretching away. Steam rises from it in ghostly tendrils. You taste the air. It's warmer, with a tang of salt and life. Birds wheel overhead, their calls carrying across the stillness. It's like the Arctic has briefly pulled back a curtain to show you something different. An odd but related detail. In 1969, the US nuclear submarine USS Skate surfaced through thin ice near the North Pole in February, the middle of winter. Conditions should have been impenetrable, yet the crew found a lead of open water and thin ice just thick enough to crack. Scientists attribute this to shifting wind patterns and currents, but it's still remarkable that such openings can occur so close to the pole, even in the harshest season. The possibility of warm water inflow also touches on a deeper, more speculative idea that geothermal heat may play a role in Arctic anomalies. While most volcanic and geothermal activity is concentrated along tectonic boundaries, the Arctic has its share of seamounts, hydrothermal vents, and even active volcanoes, such as those on Iceland and Jan Mayen. If similar features exist under the central Arctic Ocean, they could locally warm water and thin ice above. Such areas might remain partially ice-free year-round, invisible to satellites in past centuries, but perhaps stumbled upon by explorers who found them baffling. Picture it from above, a vast sheet of ice, fractured here and there by cracks and leads, and then, Unexpectedly, a round or irregular patch of open sea, dark against the surrounding white. From a distance it could look like a hole in the world itself, the kind of sight that sticks in the mind long after the journey is over. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, from the late 1800s, about a Norwegian whaler who claimed to have found such an opening north of Franz Josef Land. He described sailing into it under a strangely mild wind and finding the water teeming with fish. But when he tried to return months later, the place was gone, sealed over by ice. Whether this was truth, tall tale, or a misremembered Paulinia, it's exactly the sort of thing that feeds into the myth of a hidden northern gateway. Modern research has confirmed that the Arctic is not the static frozen block many once imagined. In 2017, a massive Paulinia opened in the Weddell Sea near Antarctica, a southern analogue that shocked scientists because of its size and persistence. The mechanism there was linked to deep ocean mixing and warm water upwelling. If such an event can occur in the south, why not in the north? The relationship between warm currents and climate change has also added a new twist. As Arctic sea ice thins, warm Atlantic water can intrude further north, potentially creating more open water areas in the future. In a strange way, the Lost World imagery might become more relevant, not because a hidden Eden will be revealed, but because the Arctic will show us environments that, for most of human history, were simply inaccessible. And yet, the romance of it remains. Standing on the edge of an ice floe, staring at water that shouldn't be there, you can't help but wonder, what if it goes somewhere? What if, just beyond the curve of the Earth, that water spills into a channel that leads under the ice, into a place where green valleys wait in the dark? You know the science says otherwise, but science has never fully explained the pull of the unknown. Maybe that's why these warm patches feel like clues. They're not proof of anything extraordinary, at least not yet, but they disrupt the neatness of the map. They whisper that the Arctic is alive, unpredictable, and possibly still hiding a secret or two. And if you were searching for a door into another world, wouldn't you start where the rules break first? Warm water beneath the ice is one thing, but what about warmth long gone, written not in currents or Paulinias, but in stone? If the Arctic is, and always has been, a barren freezer, then the rocks and sediments beneath it haven't been paying attention. They tell a different story. Let's start with the authoritative fact. Paleontologists and geologists have repeatedly uncovered fossils of temperate and even tropical species in the high Arctic. In 2004, a team drilling into Ellesmere Island in Canada found fossilized wood from swamp cypress trees, the kind that today grow in warm, wet environments like the southeastern United States. The wood was about 50 million years old, dating to the Eocene epoch, when global temperatures were significantly higher than today. And it's not just plants. Fossilized remains of alligators and giant tortoises have been found in the same region, creatures that could never survive in the modern Arctic climate. Even more startling are the bones of ancient camels discovered on Ellesmere in 2006. DNA analysis linked them to modern camels, suggesting they evolved in North America before spreading to Asia and Africa. Yes, the animal we associate with hot deserts may have had an ancestor adapted to life in polar forests. The odd fact here. In 2012, researchers studying sediment cores from the Lomonosov Ridge, an underwater mountain range in the central Arctic Ocean, discovered fossilized pollen and plant matter, indicating that 56 million years ago, the Arctic supported dense forests, with temperatures similar to modern-day Oregon. That's right. The middle of what is now an ice-covered ocean was once ringed by green shores and teeming with life. Hypothesis time. While mainstream science attributes these ancient warm periods to changes in Earth's orbit, atmospheric CO2, and continental positions, some fringe theories propose something more unusual, that the Arctic's warmth in certain eras might have been locally maintained by geothermal heat, or even by unique oceanographic patterns that trapped warmth. And if such localized warming could happen in the past, could it happen again on a smaller scale today, hidden from our satellites by shifting ice. Historians and scientists are still debating just how stable those ancient warm periods were. Some evidence suggests they lasted millions of years. Others argue they may have been punctuated by sudden cold snaps. What everyone agrees on is that life adapted to those conditions, and when the climate shifted, many species either evolved, migrated, or died out. Picture it. 50 million years ago, you're standing where the North Pole will someday be. But instead of a frozen plain, you're surrounded by towering trees dripping with moss, their branches alive with insects. Birds call from the canopy. The air is thick and damp, smelling faintly of resin. A rustle in the undergrowth reveals something like a giant tapir nosing through ferns. The sun arcs low in the sky even in summer, but its warmth is constant enough to keep frost at bay. This is not the Arctic, you know. An odd but charming detour. In 2011, paleobotanists discovered fossilized seeds of water lilies in Arctic sediments. These plants require ice-free water and long-growing seasons. They would have floated lazily on ponds where, today, only the most rugged ice algae survive. It's a reminder that the polar regions have worn many different faces over geological time. So how do we square this with the Lost World idea? One possibility is that these ancient warm climates left more than just fossils. They may have carved out geological structures, valleys, and basins that, under the right conditions, could once again support life. If those structures are now buried under kilometres of ice, they would be inaccessible to us, but perhaps not to whatever myths say lives beneath. Consider also the possibility that human memory is longer than we think. Some fringe anthropologists argue that oral traditions can preserve details for thousands of years. If Arctic peoples have legends of green lands beyond the ice, could these be echoes, not from tens of millions of years ago, but from the end of the last ice age, when parts of the high Arctic may have been more habitable? Around 10,000 years ago, retreating glaciers exposed coastal areas that are now once again locked under ice. Even mainstream archaeology hints at surprises. On Wrangel Island, north of Siberia, woolly mammoths survived until about 4,000 years ago, long after they'd vanished from mainland Eurasia and North America. That means there was, quite literally, a lost world of Ice Age fauna living on a remote Arctic island at the same time as the Egyptian pyramids were being built. If such isolated refugees could exist then, could smaller hidden ones persist now? Let's step into the role of a modern scientist drilling into the Arctic permafrost. Each core sample is like a layered time capsule. Top layers of recent soil and ice, deeper layers of glacial deposits, and then, suddenly, a section of dark, fibrous material. Under the microscope, it's revealed to be ancient plant tissue, preserved in perfect detail. The cells tell you this plant once grew in warm, wet conditions. You're holding a piece of evidence that the Arctic was once green, and if it was green before, it could in theory be green again under the right circumstances. The fringe interpretation, and it is fringe, goes like this. Perhaps parts of the Arctic never fully lost that warmth, but have remained hidden by the changing environment. Maybe geothermal vents, combined with favourable ocean currents, have preserved microclimates that don't match the rest of the region. These could be the seeds from which myths of an inner paradise sprouted. Science doesn't confirm this. But neither can it completely erase the possibility without exhaustive exploration. In the end, the fossils remind us of something important. The Arctic we see today is just one chapter in a long, varied story. It has been a swamp, a forest, a grazing plain, and a hunting ground for predators that no longer exist. And if it could change so dramatically in the past, then perhaps its present form is not as permanent as we assume. The rocks whisper that the ice is a mask, and masks can be removed. So you leave the fossil beds behind, your hands still dusty with the imprint of a cypress leaf that hasn't seen sunlight in millions of years, and you look north again. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the ice still hides whatever it chooses to keep. The fossils remind you that the Arctic has not always been the Arctic, that beneath its modern frost lies a memory of forests and animals far removed from the endless white. But there is another kind of illusion here, one that doesn't require millions of years to shape. It can appear in a single afternoon, hang in the air for an hour, and then dissolve into nothing. All it needs is the right combination of temperature, light, and distance. The authoritative fact, one of the most famous Arctic optical illusions, is called the Fata Morgana. This mirage occurs when layers of air at different temperatures bend light in unusual ways, stacking and distorting distant objects. Ships can appear to float above the horizon. Islands can seem taller or closer than they really are. Entire coastlines can appear where none exist. Named after the sorceress Morgan Le Fay from Arthurian legend, the Fata Morgana has been recorded not only in the Arctic but also in deserts and over large bodies of water. In the far north, however, the effect can be especially dramatic because the temperature differences between air layers are so extreme. The odd fact is that explorers have sometimes sketched and mapped these illusions as if they were real geography. In 1818, British navigator John Ross claimed to see mountains blocking Lancaster Sound, an observation that convinced him there was no Northwest Passage in that direction. He turned his ship around, missing the chance to make a major discovery. Years later, it was realised that Ross had been fooled by a mirage. The Croker Mountains he charted never existed. Now for the hypothesis. What if some of the lands beyond the ice described in polar legends were products of such mirages? Imagine being an early explorer, exhausted, half frozen, scanning the horizon for weeks without change, and then, suddenly, seeing green hills, open water, or even what looks like a city glinting in the light. Would you not record it? Would you not try to reach it? And if you failed, might your successors assume you were telling tales rather than reporting an atmospheric trick? Historians are still debating how often mirages shape the course of polar exploration. Some argue they were rare distractions. Others point out that in a place where visibility and navigation were already precarious, such illusions could easily redirect expeditions, sometimes fatally. If a ship turned toward a mirage instead of its intended course, it might end up trapped in ice or wrecked on unseen shoals. Let's step into the moment. You're standing on the deck of a 19th century ship, bundled in layers against a wind so cold it cuts like glass. For days, you've seen nothing but a flat white horizon. The light is strange, pale, almost metallic. Then, far ahead, something shimmers. You squint, and the shapes begin to take form. A row of cliffs, impossibly high, their tops catching the low Arctic sun. Between them, what might be a valley, green and inviting. Your heart jumps. You call others to look. Some see it, some don't. The angle of their view changes the illusion, but you can't shake the certainty that it's there, waiting. An odd detour into aviation history. In the 1920s and 30s, polar pilots also reported strange aerial phenomena. One such account comes from Norwegian explorer Roald Amundson's pilot, Lincoln Ellsworth, who described landforms in the clouds while flying over the Arctic Ocean. Some of these sightings were likely cloud reflections on the ice, but others were harder to explain. Pilots occasionally followed what they thought were coastlines, only to have them vanish. The disorientation could be so complete that even compasses seemed unreliable, swinging slightly off course as if influenced by some unseen force. While science comfortably explains mirages as light-bending effects, the mind doesn't always accept such a tidy answer in the moment. For an explorer primed to expect the unexpected, the difference between illusion and revelation can feel razor-thin. Now here's where it gets interesting for the Lost World idea. If a mirage can convincingly show open water, warm land, or even vegetation, then it can act as a kind of seed for myth. A single report can spread through sailors' gossip, lodge itself in cartographic notes, and survive for decades as a mystery on the map. By the time later expeditions disprove it, the story has already taken root, and some people will never accept the retraction. Some modern fringe theorists even suggest that mirages might occasionally reveal real locations beyond the visible horizon, Perhaps through atmospheric ducting, where light follows the curve of the Earth over long distances. This is speculative, but not entirely outside the bounds of physics. If true, it could mean that a rare alignment of conditions might give an observer a fleeting view of a place they could not otherwise see. In the Arctic, that could be the glimpse that fuels a lifetime of searching. Consider another example. In 1907, members of the Baldwin-Ziegler Polar Expedition reported seeing a landmass north of Ellesmere Island, which they named Crocker. And over the next few years, other explorers claimed to have seen it too. But when Donald Baxter Macmillan led an expedition to find it in 1913, he chased the mirage for days, trudging over ice toward what seemed like a fixed point, only for it to retreat endlessly until it vanished. Macmillan later admitted it was likely a Fata Morgana, but by then the legend had already spread. It's not hard to see how such events could intertwine with older tales of hidden realms. An indigenous hunter might see a mirage and interpret it within the framework of a spiritual world. A European explorer might chart it as a physical location. Both are seeking to understand the same fleeting vision, but their interpretations feed into very different narratives, both of which can persist long after the ice has reclaimed the view. And here's a thought experiment. Imagine if you combine the Fata Morgana effect with a real, unusual geographic feature, say, a large polynya or geothermal oasis. You might see it from a distance only under rare conditions, leading to scattered, inconsistent reports. To some, it would be proof of a hidden world. To others, just another mirage. The truth could be a blend of both. A real place glimpsed so rarely that it became indistinguishable from legend. By the time the illusion fades, leaving nothing but the flat white expanse, you're left with more questions than answers. Did you see a trick of the light, or did you catch a rare, true glimpse of something that lies beyond reach? In the Arctic, the line between the two is thinner than anywhere else on Earth. And maybe, just maybe, that's the point. If the age of wooden ships and hand-drawn maps filled the Arctic with mystery, the 20th century did something curious. It didn't erase that mystery. It simply moved it underground, under code names, inside briefcases locked with brass clasps. The search for lost worlds was replaced, at least officially, by the search for military advantage. And if you want a setting where secrecy thrives, you could hardly choose better than the top of the planet. The authoritative fact, during the Cold War, the Arctic became a strategic chessboard for both the United States and the Soviet Union. Long-range bombers and later, intercontinental ballistic missiles would pass over the polar regions on their way to targets. That meant the shortest, fastest route for nuclear war also ran directly over the ice cap. Surveillance, early warning, and reconnaissance missions over the Arctic weren't optional. They were critical. The odd fact: both superpowers established drifting ice stations, actual research and monitoring outposts built on large, stable flows. These weren't fixed like Antarctic bases. They moved with the ice, sometimes hundreds of kilometers over a single season. The Soviets launched the first, North Pole 1, in 1937, long before the Cold War began, and the US followed with its own versions decades later. These stations collected scientific data, but they also served as listening posts and staging areas for covert missions. Hypothesis time. What if some of these missions, officially focused on military objectives, stumbled across anomalies in the ice or unexplained geographic features? In the atmosphere of Cold War secrecy, such discoveries wouldn't have been publicized. Classified reports might have been filed away, accessible only to a handful of intelligence officers. From the outside, it would look like nothing happened at all. Historians are still debating how much the militarization of the Arctic concealed from civilian science. There are examples of declassified material revealing that military expeditions mapped certain regions in far greater detail than public charts showed. In some cases, satellite imagery from the era has been released with curious gaps, missing frames, blurred areas, or noise that obscures the surface. Officially, this is chalked up to technical limitations, or the need to protect strategic sites. Unofficially, it leaves a lot of room for speculation. Picture a reconnaissance flight in the early 1960s. A US Air Force RB-47 or Soviet Tu-95 Bear bomber is skimming the edge of the polar night, cameras clicking through open hatches. On the instruments, there's a brief flicker, maybe a compass swing, maybe a static burst on the radio. The crew reports seeing an area of open water larger than any Polinia should be, ringed by oddly shaped ice formations. The film is processed in a darkroom behind locked doors, the negative stamped classified. Whatever the crew saw will not enter the history books. It will sit in a cabinet until someone decides to shred it. An odd detour. During the height of the Cold War, the US ran a project called Ice Station Zebra, which became the title of a 1968 spy film. The real-life missions involved nuclear submarines surfacing at the North Pole to deliver and retrieve sensitive materials, sometimes under the cover of scientific work. The Soviets naturally had their own polar submarine operations. The point here isn't the espionage, it's that both sides were operating in a space largely invisible to the public, under conditions where anything unusual could be quietly folded into the fog of secrecy. And secrecy changes the shape of a mystery. In the age of wooden ships, if an expedition saw something strange, they might write about it in a log, and that log might eventually make its way into print. In the Cold War, if a spy plane saw something strange, the report might be locked away for decades. That means our modern understanding of the Arctic, even in the satellite age, could be missing pieces simply because they've never been declassified. Let's take a moment to consider what classified means in practice. Imagine you are a photo interpreter in 1972, working in a secure room with no windows. You have a stack of high-resolution aerial photographs taken over the Arctic. Your job is to note any Soviet installations, unusual ice formations or ship movements. On one photo, you see a shape that doesn't fit, perhaps a perfectly circular lead in the ice, too precise to be natural. You make a note, hand it up the chain, and that's the last you hear about it. The image is filed in a secure archive, and you return to your desk. You'll never know if it was an oddity, a natural formation, or something else entirely. Could this environment of secrecy have preserved real anomalies from public view? It's plausible. In the late 1990s, when some Cold War reconnaissance photos were finally released, scientists were able to study sea ice patterns from decades earlier. They found formations that, while explainable, were surprising in their size or location. If there had been something genuinely unexplained, it's easy to imagine it might never have been among the declassified set. The Soviets had their own flavour of Arctic secrecy. Their drifting stations and icebreakers ventured into remote parts of the polar basin for months at a time, accompanied by ships with hulls so reinforced they could cut through ice meters thick. Official Soviet maps often left certain areas blank or vaguely shaded, a choice explained as cartographic generalization, but one that also conveniently erased locations they didn't want foreign eyes studying. Whether those omissions were purely strategic or also concealed geological or environmental oddities is something we may never know. There's a curious irony here. The more the Arctic was mapped and monitored for military purposes, the less ordinary people knew about it. The same satellites that could read the number on a ship's hull from orbit were also capable of revealing every polynya, every iceberg, every crack in the ice. Yet much of that data was locked away, not out of malice towards science, but because in the logic of the Cold War, any information might be useful to the enemy. And so, as with so many other parts of the Arctic story, the official record is patchy. Gaps in data, blurred images, vague coordinates. These are the Cold War's equivalent of the blank spaces on old maps. And if you believe in hidden worlds, it's tempting to imagine that some of those gaps hide more than just military hardware. In the end, the Cold War turned the Arctic into a stage for a different kind of exploration, one where the audience was carefully chosen and the script was never made public. It's possible that in those years of silent flights and drifting stations, Someone saw something they couldn't explain, and if they did, the knowledge is still up there, frozen in a file cabinet somewhere, waiting for a day when the lock finally breaks. The Cold War files stay locked, the photographs remain classified, and the Arctic's most secretive decades retreat back into shadow. But the sky still tells its own stories. If the drifting stations and spy flights belong to the language of politics, the aurora belongs to something older, quieter, and much harder to pin down. It's both signal and disguise, a phenomenon that dazzles while hiding the space behind it. The authoritative fact is simple. Auroras occur when charged particles from the solar wind spiral along Earth's magnetic field lines and collide with atoms and molecules in the upper atmosphere. This interaction excites the atmospheric gases, causing them to emit light, green from oxygen about 100 kilometers up, red from oxygen higher still, and blue or purple from nitrogen. The effect is more common and more intense near the magnetic poles because that's where the field lines funnel the particles most directly. The odd fact, even with our understanding of their physics, auroras are unpredictable. Forecasts exist, but they can shift dramatically with changes in solar activity. In some cases, auroras appear suddenly, as if a curtain has been pulled back without warning. For people living under them, this unpredictability has made them a perfect metaphor for thresholds, for moments when the ordinary world slips into something extraordinary. Hypothesis time. Could the aurora be more than just a light show? Some fringe theories, and even a few open-minded geophysicists, have wondered whether auroral activity could be linked to subtle atmospheric changes at ground level, like small shifts in temperature, air ionization, or even acoustic phenomena too low for humans to hear. If such effects exist, they might be most pronounced directly under the auroral oval, the ring-shaped zone where the lights appear most often. To ancient travellers, those changes might have felt like crossing into a different realm. Historians are still debating how to interpret the aurora's place in Arctic oral traditions. The Sami of Scandinavia viewed it with reverence and caution. Inuit tales describe the lights as spirits at play, sometimes benign, sometimes dangerous. In both cases, there's an implied border, a don't step too far quality that mirrors the way explorers speak about the edge of known maps. It's an invitation and a warning in equal measure. Picture standing alone on the ice, deep into the polar night. The air is so cold that your breath freezes into tiny crystals before falling to the snow. The horizon is flat, black, empty. And then the first wave of green appears, sweeping from one side of the sky to the other. It moves slowly, deliberately, like a living thing deciding where to go next. Behind it, the stars blur. You have the sudden, irrational feeling that the aurora is hiding something, that if it vanished instantly you'd see something else there, a shape, a landscape, a doorway. This feeling isn't just poetic fancy. During strong auroral displays, the lights can be bright enough to cast shadows, altering the way familiar landmarks appear. Ice. Ridges seem taller, snowfields ripple like fabric. If you didn't already know the terrain, you might imagine the world was shifting right in front of you. It's easy to understand how such an experience could be woven into myths about hidden lands or the entrances to other realms. An odd detour. In 1893, members of Fridtjof Nansen's Arctic expedition recorded a night when the aurora seemed to form parallel bands that stretched all the way to the horizon. Nansen described it as a vault, like the roof of some vast building. The image is striking, not just light in the sky, but architecture, as if the aurora were outlining the walls of a colossal unseen hall. It's not hard to imagine how such a vision could be reinterpreted as a sign of a physical place beyond the lights. Now imagine layering that visual with the political atmosphere of the Cold War. Pilots on reconnaissance missions reported auroral displays so bright they interfered with their ability to track visual targets on the ice. Instruments sometimes picked up unusual bursts of static during such displays. Nothing that couldn't be explained by solar interference, but strange enough to make note of in mission logs. It's tempting to wonder whether some of those noise readings coincided with moments when the aurora was at its most intense, as if the lights were not only obscuring the view, but scrambling the senses as well. Fringe interpretations go further, suggesting that the aurora might act like a natural camouflage, not intentionally of course, but as a side effect of its brightness and shifting forms. If there were unusual terrain features, warm water zones, or even entrances to vast subglacial caverns in the Arctic, an active aurora could make them harder to detect from a distance. In the age before GPS and radar mapping, this would have been even more pronounced. There's a poetic symmetry here. The aurora is caused by interactions between the Sun and Earth, a meeting of cosmic and planetary forces. Legends of hidden worlds at the pole often describe them as places where two realms meet, the known and the unknown, the living and the spirit world, the outer and the inner Earth. In both science and myth, the aurora marks a zone of crossing, and perhaps that's why the aurora feels like a veil. It's not just that it covers the sky, it's that it moves, teasing with glimpses, hinting at shapes behind the light. Curtains are meant to be drawn aside, veils are meant to be lifted. In the human mind, what is hidden is always more compelling than what is revealed. When the aurora finally fades and the stars return, the land looks exactly as it did before. Nothing has changed, at least nothing you can prove. But the impression lingers, the sense that you stood at the edge of something vast and unseen. It's the same feeling explorers have when they stare at a map and see the blank spaces, the same pull that sends people into deserts, jungles, and across oceans. In the Arctic, the aurora is the blank space in the sky, and maybe, just maybe, what lies behind it is more than just darkness. Once the aurora fades, the compass is your next guide. That small, deceptively simple instrument that explorers have trusted for centuries. It's the arrow pointing north, the needle that aligns with an invisible force threading through the planet. In most of the world it behaves well enough, but here, near the top of the Earth, that steady needle starts to dance. The authoritative fact, the geographic North Pole, the fixed point marking the Earth's axis of rotation, is not the same as the magnetic North Pole, which is where your compass actually points. The magnetic pole is a shifting location defined by the planet's magnetic field, and it moves constantly. In fact, it has been racing across the Arctic at a rate of up to 55 kilometers per year in recent decades, migrating from Canada toward Russia. This movement is caused by changes in the flow of molten iron deep within the Earth's outer core, which generates the magnetic field. The odd fact: early explorers sometimes found their compasses behaving so erratically near the pole that they abandoned them altogether, relying instead on the position of the sun and stars. In extreme cases, the needle would spin in slow, lazy circles, refusing to settle. In 1909, Robert Peary's team reported that within a certain radius of the magnetic pole, traditional navigation was essentially useless. Even in modern times, pilots have noted magnetic noise over parts of the high Arctic, fluctuations strong enough to require recalibration of navigation systems mid-flight. Hypothesis time. Could the magnetic anomalies near the pole have inspired or reinforced myths of a hidden entrance or gateway? If the Earth's magnetism seems to falter in one place, it's not such a leap, especially for earlier explorers, to imagine that this is the hinge of the world, a point where the normal rules no longer apply. In some hollow Earth theories, the polar regions are literally magnetic vortexes, pulling compasses toward the rim of an opening. While mainstream science doesn't support this, the historical accounts of erratic readings give such ideas fertile ground to grow. Historians are still debating the extent to which magnetic anomalies affected the mapping of the Arctic. Inaccurate bearings could have shifted recorded coastlines, misplaced islands, and even created phantom features on maps, some of which persisted for decades before being corrected. It's easy to see how such errors could be mistaken for the Arctic hiding parts of itself. Picture it. You're the navigator on a wooden-hulled exploration ship in the late 19th century. Your charts are painstakingly drawn from earlier voyages. The compass is your lifeline. But now, somewhere in the endless ice, your readings begin to drift. One day, they're only a few degrees off. The next, they're swinging wildly. You check the sun's position, the stars when they're visible, but nothing matches. The captain wants to know if you can plot a course home. You say yes, but in truth you're guessing, because the world's most trusted pointer is no longer pointing where it should. An odd detour. In 1962, during a geomagnetic survey in the Canadian Arctic, researchers found localized spots where magnetic readings spiked or dropped sharply within just a few meters. Most were traced to large deposits of magnetite in the rock, but a few remained unexplained, even after multiple passes. One scientist half-jokingly called them door handles, invisible patches of magnetism that seem to lead nowhere. And here's a tantalizing thought. Magnetic anomalies aren't always random. Some follow patterns tied to geological structures, such as ancient impact craters or fault lines. If the Arctic hides large buried features, say the remnants of an ancient mountain range, or even the edge of a massive subglacial basin, those could subtly distort the local magnetic field. A person encountering such a distortion without the language of modern geophysics might interpret it as something far stranger. Fringe researchers sometimes tie these anomalies to the idea of a shielded region, a zone where the magnetic field behaves differently, perhaps masking the presence of an opening or a void. While this drifts far from mainstream science, it's rooted in a simple truth. Our planet's magnetic field is not uniform, and the Arctic is a particularly dynamic place for it. The molten currents in the core shift, the field changes, and the needle above responds in ways that can still surprise us. Let's consider the psychological side. In the disorienting Arctic environment, where visibility can drop to near zero, landmarks are few, and day and night blur into months-long stretches, a failing compass can push the mind toward imagination. If the instrument you've trusted most betrays you, maybe the map is wrong too. Maybe the world isn't shaped the way you've been told, and maybe, just maybe, there's something just out of reach where the magnetism bends. Even modern navigation isn't immune. Aircraft crossing the high Arctic today have to adjust their instruments when flying over the pole, sometimes using grid navigation instead of magnetic bearings. This system aligns the compass to an artificial grid overlaid on the map, sidestepping the wild swings near the pole. But it's a reminder that even with satellites and advanced avionics, the top of the world refuses to play entirely by our rules. So the magnetic needle becomes more than a tool. It's a symbol. It's the thing that's supposed to be certain, unwavering, impartial. And when it falters here, it feels like the Arctic is winking at you, as if to say, I know where true north is. But I'm not telling. In the end, the shifting, swirling magnetism of the pole is both a scientific puzzle and a storyteller's dream. It's a physical force that can be measured in Teslas and Gauss, but also a metaphor for how this place unsettles the mind. The pole moves, the field changes, the readings twist. And somewhere, in the middle of that dance, the legends of hidden worlds find room to breathe. If magnetic compasses can lose their way near the top of the Earth, perhaps it's because the land itself remembers sudden, disorienting changes, not in degrees or bearings, but in climate, in life, in the very rules of survival. And no relic tells that story more vividly than the mammoth. The authoritative fact, the remains of woolly mammoths, perfectly preserved in permafrost, have been found across Siberia, Alaska, and Canada. Some are so intact that their stomach contents are still present, their skin still holds pigment, and their flesh, in rare cases, is edible. Or at least it was eaten by a few brave or reckless explorers and dogs in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The best preserved specimens suggest these creatures died suddenly, their bodies frozen almost instantly in conditions cold enough to prevent decay for tens of thousands of years. The odd fact: some of these mammoths still had unchewed food in their mouths, grasses and flowers that could only have grown in a relatively temperate climate. That means that, at the moment of their death, these animals were not in a howling blizzard, but in a mild, grassy landscape. Something changed very quickly, sealing them in ice. Hypothesis time. Mainstream science explains these rapid freezes through a combination of sudden climate shifts at the end of the last ice age and changes in local geography that trapped cold air. But more speculative theories, some of which bleed into the Lost World narrative, suggest something more dramatic: a sudden crustal shift or a rapid influx of cold air from high-altitude disturbances. In extreme versions, these events are imagined as the collapse of a barrier between a warm Arctic basin and the frigid outer climate, effectively slamming the door on a once temperate refuge. Historians and paleontologists are still debating whether these mammoths represent localized catastrophes or part of a global event. Some evidence points to a younger Dryas cooling period around 12,800 years ago, possibly triggered by a comet or meteor impact, which rapidly dropped global temperatures. This would have been devastating for large herbivores adapted to milder Ice Age conditions, but the abruptness of the freeze in some individual cases remains puzzling. Picture it: a late Pleistocene summer afternoon in what is now the Siberian tundra. The air is warm enough to hum with insects, the ground dotted with purple wildflowers. A small herd of mammoths grazes by a river, pulling up clumps of grass with their trunks. Then something shifts. A wind rises, colder than any they felt, carrying with it the scent of ice and dust. Within hours the sky darkens. Snow begins to fall, not the slow drifting kind, but a heavy blinding sheet driven by a relentless gale. The temperature plunges, and by morning the land is locked in ice. Those caught in low ground or near water may be buried quickly, preserved for millennia in a frozen tomb. An odd detour: in 1901, the Berezovka mammoth was excavated from a riverbank in Siberia, so well preserved that its last meal, buttercups, wild onions and grasses, could be identified. Its posture suggested it had fallen suddenly, possibly into a crevasse or slump of earth, before being covered in ice and sediment. Nearby, the soil layers showed signs of disturbance, as if the ground had shifted abruptly. For those inclined towards speculative geology, events like this are irresistible. They see in the mammoth's fate evidence that the Arctic's climate can change not over centuries but overnight. If that's possible, then perhaps hidden oases or warm valleys could appear and disappear in the same way, opening briefly before being swallowed again by ice. In the context of our Lost World hypothesis, such volatility could explain why legends speak of lands that move or that vanish, places glimpsed by one generation and gone by the next. Mainstream science takes a more cautious view. Permafrost preservation requires specific conditions: quick burial, low temperatures, and little oxygen. In some cases, a combination of flooding and sudden freeze could create these conditions in hours or days without invoking any world-shaking catastrophe. But even scientists acknowledge that the end of the Ice Age brought abrupt swings in climate, changes fast enough to reshape ecosystems and wipe out megafauna across continents. Let's step for a moment into the mind of an early 20th century prospector in Siberia. You're digging along a riverbank for gold when your shovel strikes something fibrous. You pull back the soil and see hair. Long, coarse, reddish-brown. It's attached to skin. As you clear more, you realize you're uncovering a massive head, the curved tip of a tusk emerging from the earth. The air is suddenly thick with a smell unlike anything you've known. The deep, musty scent of something that has been locked away for longer than human memory. You don't know whether to feel awe, fear, or opportunity. Such finds fed not only paleontology but also trade. In the 19th century, mammoth ivory was harvested in large quantities from Siberia, sometimes by the ton, and shipped to markets in Europe and Asia. The trade continues in a smaller, regulated form today. But behind the economic value, the mammoth tusks and bones carry a quieter message. The Arctic is a vault. It keeps what it chooses to keep in perfect condition until it's ready to let it go. And here's a more unsettling angle. If entire ecosystems can be preserved under the ice, what else might be down there? We've seen ancient seeds germinate after thousands of years in permafrost. We've revived bacteria from similar conditions. Could there be traces of extinct ecosystems, even ancient human campsites frozen in waiting? If so, the Arctic may hold not just the memory of a lost world, but actual fragments of it, waiting for someone to dig in the right place. So the mammoth stands in the mind like a warning and a promise. A warning that the Arctic can change without notice, taking life with it. A promise that, in doing so, it can also preserve that life with impossible fidelity. For those who dream of a hidden northern realm, the mammoth is proof that the Arctic has sheltered life before, and might again. The mammoth bones are heavy in your hands, but the weight they carry isn't only physical. They press down with time, with the reminder that the Arctic has been many things before it became what you see now. And while the paleontologists tell their story in strata and isotopes, another kind of history runs in parallel. It is the history of what people have said about this place, and what they still say. That the North is not empty, that beneath its ice and rock lies another realm. The authoritative fact, across vastly different cultures, from Scandinavia to the Bering Strait, there are myths of underworlds, inner realms, or hidden lands accessible through the far north. In Norse cosmology, the world tree Yggdrasil connects 9 worlds, one of which, Svartalfaheim, the realm of the dwarves, lies beneath the earth, rich with treasures and secrets. In Inuit tradition, there are stories of Chikkiktaluk and other lands beyond the ice, some warm, some inhabited by beings both human and not. In Siberian, Yakut and Evenki traditions, shamans speak of travelling through underground rivers to reach the lower worlds, guided by animal spirits. The odd fact: some of these traditions share uncanny structural similarities, despite originating thousands of kilometres apart. They speak of thresholds in the landscape, caves, cracks in the ice, places where the land drops suddenly away, as if they are not just geographic features, but doors. And in more than one of these traditions, the farthest north is not the end of the world, but the entrance to it. Hypothesis time. Could these stories share a common ancestor, passed along ancient trade routes or migration paths? Anthropologists know that the ancestors of many Inuit and Siberian peoples once moved back and forth across the Bering Land Bridge during the Ice Ages. Along with tools and goods, they would have carried stories that could have been reshaped over millennia to fit each culture's worldview. If an ancestral tale began as a memory of a real warm refuge in the north, it might survive as myth long after the refuge itself disappeared. Historians are still debating whether mythic parallels like these point to shared origins or to a universal human tendency to imagine the world as layered, with the visible realm sitting atop hidden ones. But even the skeptics admit that the geography of the Arctic makes it fertile ground for such thinking. The land hides more than it shows. The weather changes the landscape daily. Rivers vanish under snow and emerge kilometres away. If the surface is this tricky, why not imagine something even more intricate beneath? Picture a Norse skald telling of Yggdrasil on a winter night in a mead hall. Outside, snow falls in thick silence. Inside, the fire flickers, shadows stretching across carved beams. His voice describes the roots of the world tree plunging into realms unseen, into the dark where the dwarves forge weapons and the dead gather in hell. Then picture, half a world away, an Inuit elder on the coast, the firelight catching the curve of a sealskin parka. She speaks of a journey her grandfather took in a dream, across the sea ice, and into a place where the air was warm and the grass grew high, a place where the spirits of animals walked freely. An odd detour? The Yakut people of Siberia have a story of Olonko, a hero who descends into the underworld through a hole in the ice. This realm is not hellish but rich, filled with resources, guarded by beings who test the hero's worth before granting him safe passage. In many tellings, the entrance is seasonal, appearing only at certain times of the year and only to those who know where to look. If you strip away the cosmological frameworks, the world tree, the animal spirits, the spirit-guarded gates, what remains is the same structural motif, a hidden entry point in the far north that leads to a land unlike the one above. This is precisely the skeleton of the Lost World narrative, one that doesn't depend on Hollow Earth physics to resonate. Fringe theorists sometimes suggest that such myths are distorted memories of refugia, areas that remained habitable during the Ice Ages, possibly due to geothermal heat. Mainstream archaeology accepts that refugia existed, though they were generally smaller and less fantastical than the mythic lands. But if you were a small group of hunter-gatherers surviving in a patch of green surrounded by ice, wouldn't it feel like you had stumbled into another world entirely? Let's imagine one of these refugia. It's the height of the glacial period. Ice walls rise on the horizon, but here, in a narrow valley, warm springs keep the ground soft. Moss and grass cling to the soil. Small birch trees bend under the weight of snow that melts quickly in the sun. Caribou graze, and birds nest in the cliffs. For the people who find it, this place is not just shelter. It is proof that life can flourish against the odds. It becomes a story worth passing down, embroidered with each retelling until the valley is a kingdom, and the springs are rivers flowing through golden halls. Historians are still piecing together the migration and contact patterns that could have spread such motifs. The Norse reached Greenland by the 10th century and traded, sometimes violently, with Inuit groups. Before them, generations of Siberian peoples had crossed eastward into the Americas, and before that, the Ice Age world was a web of movement, slow, perilous, but persistent. Stories could travel along it just as surely as ivory or obsidian. The common threads in these northern myths, warmth hidden in cold, access through a narrow or concealed path, guardians or tests before entry, are the same threads we've been tracing in the Arctic's physical mysteries. They tie the mammoth's sudden freezing to the mirage on the horizon, the Polinia's open water to the compass that won't settle, and they suggest that the lost world at the pole is as much a product of human memory as of physical possibility. By the time you leave the firelit storytelling circle, whether it's in a Norse hall or an Inuit winter camp, the night feels different. The land around you might be silent and frozen, but the stories have changed it. Every shadowed ridge could hide an entrance. Every patch of fog could be the breath of a place you're not supposed to see. The myths are still warm in your mind. Stories of hidden valleys and guarded entrances, of warmth tucked away in a sea of ice. But now, you turn to modern science, wondering if any of it could fit into the physical reality of the Arctic. And here's the surprising thing. In some ways, it can. Not as vast underground kingdoms or magical realms, but as rare, localized phenomena scientists sometimes call polar oases. The authoritative fact: certain parts of the Arctic remain ice-free year-round, even in extreme cold. These are usually linked to geothermal activity, wind patterns, or upwelling warm ocean currents. One well-known example is Axel Heiberg Island in the Canadian high Arctic, where hot springs flow even in winter, creating patches of unfrozen ground. Another is Svalbard, a Norwegian archipelago where coal seams smoulder underground, naturally warming small areas. These spots are tiny compared to the mythic lands of legend, but in the scale of Arctic survival, they are oases all the same. The odd fact? Some polar oases host unique ecosystems found nowhere else. On Axel Heiberg, the springs are lined with rare microbial mats that survive on minerals and heat rather than sunlight. In Svalbard, certain moss and grass species thrive in geothermal pockets, while the surrounding land lies buried under meters of snow. For migrating animals and humans in desperate situations, stumbling across such a place could mean the difference between life and death. Hypothesis time. Could these polar oases be the kernels of truth behind the legends? Imagine that, centuries or millennia ago, an explorer or hunter reached one. They'd find open ground, flowing water, perhaps even trees in ancient times. Returning home, they'd tell of a place where the north was not cold but green, where the air felt different and the earth gave off heat. Such stories, passed down and reshaped, could grow into the grander visions of hidden worlds we hear today. Historians and geologists are still debating the full extent of geothermal activity under the Arctic ice. While most volcanic and geothermal zones are at the boundaries of tectonic plates, the Arctic Ocean's Gackle Ridge, a spreading ridge beneath the ice, is volcanically active. In 1999, researchers found evidence of fresh lava flows along the ridge, suggesting eruptions had occurred recently in geological terms. Though deep underwater, such activity could warm pockets of the overlying ocean and influence local ice cover. Picture it, an aerial view of the Arctic in midwinter. The ice is a flat, unbroken expanse, except for one dark oval, where steam rises in a pale plume. If you could land there, you'd find the ice thin or absent, the water moving, warmer than the air by several degrees. Seabirds cluster at the edge, diving for fish drawn to the open sea. This is no tropical paradise, but in a land where freezing is the default, it would feel almost miraculous. An odd detour. In 1971, a Soviet scientific team studying Franz Josef Land reported an ice-free area in the dead of winter, surrounded by cliffs. They recorded air temperatures 10 degrees Celsius warmer than the regional average, and moss growing in sheltered spots. While the team attributed this to unusual wind patterns and perhaps geothermal influence, the site's exact location was never widely publicised. The report itself sat in a library archive for decades before resurfacing. In the more speculative realm, some researchers have floated the idea that geothermal heat trapped under thick ice could, in theory, maintain subglacial lakes or valleys for tens of thousands of years. Antarctica has such lakes, the most famous being Lake Vostok, buried under nearly 4 kilometres of ice. If the Arctic harboured something similar in the past, and if it were ever partially exposed, it would have been indistinguishable from the hidden lands described in myth. Let's imagine the experience of encountering such a place without knowing the science. You've been travelling across ice for weeks. The horizon has been a single white line under a pale sky. Then, without warning, you crest a ridge and see open ground ahead. Dark earth, water shimmering in the weak sun, birds calling. The air smells faintly of soil and plants. In that moment, you're convinced you've stepped into a different world. When you return to your people, how do you describe it? A valley? A sanctuary? Or something greater? A hidden realm the land does not want to reveal to everyone? Geologists point out that the Arctic's volcanic features are largely hidden, either underwater or beneath thick permafrost. But occasional signs break the surface: hot springs, unusual ice, patterns, even the rare eruption of Beerenberg volcano on Jan Mayen Island. These are reminders that the Arctic is not just a static, frozen cap. It's a living, shifting system, with heat moving through it in unexpected ways. Fringe interpretations tie polar oases to larger, more dramatic possibilities. Vast geothermal basins that could, in theory, support entire ecosystems under the ice. While no evidence currently supports this on the scale required for a lost world, the existence of real, measurable warm spots gives the idea a foothold in reality. It doesn't take much imagination to bridge the gap between a steaming spring in the snow and a verdant valley hidden from the world. Historians are still debating whether any pre-modern explorers documented such oases. While the record is thin, a few early polar journals mention ice holes or warm ground without clear explanation. It's possible these were small-scale polynyas or patches of wind-blown earth, or perhaps they were exactly what they sounded like: unexpected warmth in the kingdom of cold. In the end, polar oases are proof that the Arctic is not entirely what it seems. Beneath its most inhospitable landscapes, life can carve out a niche. Heat can rise from the depths, breaking the surface in places no one expects. And if you were looking for a plausible foundation for the legends of a hidden northern paradise, you could do worse than start here, with the real, measurable warmth that blooms against all odds in the land of ice. The geothermal springs and ice-free pockets feel like the Arctic tipping its hand, a momentary glimpse of something more complex than the frozen facade. But if warmth can be hidden in a land of cold, what else might be? In the 20th century, the Soviet Union treated that question as a matter of state security, and their maps, logs, and reports still carry the fingerprints of secrecy. The authoritative fact: between the 1930s and the late 1980s, the Soviet Union launched dozens of scientific and military expeditions into the Arctic, establishing drifting ice stations, airfields, and remote research bases. These missions gathered data on ocean currents, ice thickness, and weather patterns, but they also had strategic purposes. The Arctic was a vital frontier in the Cold War, both as a potential route for nuclear bombers and as a place to monitor the other side's activity. The odd fact: in several surviving Soviet maps of the polar regions, certain areas are shaded in generic white or omitted entirely, despite being within zones otherwise mapped in detail. Cartographers called this generalization, meaning they simplified the features, but the result was that some coastal outlines vanished and some islands seemed to dissolve into the ice. The official reason: seasonal changes made it impossible to chart these features accurately. Unofficially, researchers have long wondered whether these emissions were also a way to mask sensitive locations. Hypothesis time. Could some of these blanks have coincided with unusual geographic features, ice-free pockets, anomalous magnetic zones, or even sites of archaeological interest? If so, they would have been prime candidates for restriction, especially if Soviet leadership feared foreign intelligence might stumble on them. Historians are still debating whether Soviet Arctic secrecy was purely military, or whether it concealed discoveries that could have had scientific or mythic significance. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a trickle of declassified documents revealed that some polar missions had reported Zone 17 and similar numbered areas as off-limits without explanation in public-facing logs. In one case, pilots flying supply missions to an ice station were told to avoid a particular set of coordinates, even though satellite photos from the same year showed no obvious hazards. Picture a Soviet drift station in the early 1970s, a cluster of prefabricated huts on a thick floe, snow piled high against their sides. Inside, the air smells of diesel and boiled cabbage. A radio operator scribbles notes as a weather balloon report comes in. Then a coded message arrives from Moscow. Do not proceed with survey transect to the north. The order is signed at a high level, and no reason is given. The ice team shrugs and turns their instruments elsewhere. The data gap remains in the official records, just another empty square in a grid of otherwise meticulous measurements. An odd detour. In 1983, the Soviet nuclear-powered icebreaker Arktika reportedly diverted from its planned route after crew members cited unusual ice conditions ahead. Later, the ship's logbook for that voyage was released with several days' entries missing. While the missing pages could be explained by bureaucratic sloppiness or classified military tests, the incident became a favourite reference point for fringe researchers convinced that the Arctic was hiding something more than shifting ice. The Soviet Arctic presence wasn't limited to the surface. Submarines regularly patrolled beneath the ice, mapping the seafloor with sonar. This produced some of the most detailed bathymetric charts of the Arctic Ocean in existence, charts that for decades were inaccessible to civilian scientists. When fragments of these maps were finally published in the 2000s, they showed features like the Lomonosov Ridge in striking detail, but also hinted at other unnamed structures. Could these be natural geological formations? Almost certainly. But the gaps, the unnamed rises and trenches, are exactly the kind of empty spaces where speculation flourishes. In the world of Cold War politics, controlling the narrative was as important as controlling territory. If the Soviets did find an unusual feature, say a large polynya in an unexpected location or a geothermal vent, they might have preferred to keep it quiet, either to preserve a tactical advantage or simply to avoid drawing international attention. The fewer people who knew about such things, the easier it was to keep them out of the diplomatic conversation. Fringe interpretations of the Soviet files often go further, suggesting that Moscow deliberately concealed evidence of ancient structures or anomalous terrain under the ice. While there's no verified proof of such finds, the theory survives because it fits so neatly into the gaps left by official records. A log entry that stops mid-sentence, a flight plan that diverts without explanation. These are the breadcrumbs that conspiracy thrives on. Let's step into the shoes of a Soviet polar pilot in the 1980s. You're flying a supply run from Murmansk to a remote station on drifting ice. The sun is low on the horizon, a pale smudge through haze. Suddenly, you see a dark patch ahead. Open water, steaming faintly. It's far from any known polynya, and you weren't briefed on its existence. You radio it in. After a pause, the reply comes, "Alter course. Do not approach." You follow orders, but the image stays with you. Months later, you hear the coordinates mentioned in a hushed conversation between two officers, and you realize you'll never know what, if anything, was there. Historians who favor a more grounded explanation point out that many restricted Arctic zones overlapped with sensitive military installations, like missile detection radar sites or submarine staging areas. But even they admit that the Arctic's remoteness means anomalies, whether natural or otherwise, could be noticed, documented, and then effectively buried. In a region where so few people go, keeping a secret is much easier. In the end, the Soviet Arctic archives are like a map with deliberate holes burned into it. You can trace the coastlines and soundings until suddenly you can't. The paper goes blank, the record stops, and the rest is left to the imagination. And in those blanks, the legend of a lost world at the pole finds another place to live. The Soviet maps leave their blank spaces like unblinking eyes. But not all Arctic mysteries are silent. Some make themselves known in a different way, through sound. And in the vast quiet of the polar regions, even a small sound can seem amplified, almost alive. The authoritative fact: the Arctic has long been a place where unusual acoustic phenomena occur. Sounds carry differently here because of the combination of ice, water, and atmosphere. Low-frequency noises can travel for hundreds of kilometers under the ice, refracting through water layers of different temperatures and salinities. This is why submarines during the Cold War could sometimes hear ships or ice movements from extraordinary distances. The odd fact: some Arctic sounds remain unexplained even after scientific investigation. In 2016, residents of Igloolik, a remote Inuit community in Nunavut, reported a mysterious pinging or humming sound coming from the seafloor in the Fury and Hecla Strait. Hunters said it was scaring away marine mammals and that they had never heard anything like it before. The Canadian military sent aircraft to investigate, but after several flights, they announced that they had found no clear source. Theories range from submarine activity to mining exploration to natural geological processes. Officially, the matter remains unsolved. Hypothesis time. Could some of these sounds be linked to hidden geographic features? Shifting ice above an open water pocket, geothermal vents releasing bursts of gas, or even movements along undersea fault lines? If such a feature existed in a specific location, the sounds it produced could be rare, intermittent, and highly localized, just enough to fuel stories of forbidden or haunted areas. Historians and anthropologists are still debating how to interpret older accounts of Arctic sounds in indigenous oral traditions. Some Inuit stories describe the earth speaking or the ice singing, often in connection with areas where game is scarce or navigation is difficult. These might be metaphors for environmental cues, or they might be literal descriptions of acoustic phenomena that Western science has only begun to study. Picture it. You're travelling by sled under a sky streaked with faint aurora. The air so still you can hear the crunch of snow under each pore. Then, from somewhere ahead, or is it below, comes a low, resonant hum. It's not like wind, and not like any animal call you know. It seems to vibrate through the ice itself, a steady, pulsing tone that makes your teeth ache. The dogs pause, ears flicking. You wait for it to fade, but it lingers, and when it finally stops, the silence feels heavier than before. An odd detour into science. During the 1990s, oceanographers from the University of Washington recorded a persistent low-frequency sound in the Arctic, later nicknamed the bloop by analogy to a similar unexplained sound in the South Pacific. The Arctic version was eventually linked to ice movement, large sheets flexing and cracking, but the recordings are still eerie. The initial analysis described it as mechanical sounding, which did nothing to dampen speculation outside the scientific community. Acoustic anomalies aren't limited to hums and pings. There are also reports of sudden booms under the ice, sometimes so loud they can be heard above the surface, startling humans and wildlife alike. These can be caused by ice shifting or by methane gas pockets releasing from the seafloor. But in areas where such events are rare, they can take on a mythic quality, remembered for years as the day the sea itself shouted. Now imagine layering this with the idea of a hidden entrance to another realm. If you believed there was a gateway somewhere under the ice, wouldn't a sudden, deep rumble feel like a sign that something beyond it was moving? It's easy to see how such experiences could be incorporated into stories about doors that open and close, or guardians signalling their presence. Fringe theories sometimes take the idea further, suggesting that some Arctic sounds might be echoes from vast hollow spaces under the ice, caverns or tunnels large enough to resonate. While no evidence supports this on a grand scale, the existence of smaller subglacial caves and water channels is well established, particularly around geothermal areas. These could, under the right conditions, act as natural resonators. Historians are still debating one particularly strange case from 1960, when a US Navy submarine under the Arctic ice recorded what crew members described as repetitive metallic taps at regular intervals. The official explanation was likely ice cracking under pressure, but the captain's log, declassified decades later, noted that the pattern continued for hours, with no obvious source nearby. It's the sort of detail that, stripped of its scientific framing, could easily become the seed of a legend. Let's return to the experience of hearing such a sound in person. The Arctic is so empty of background noise that when something intrudes it feels almost personal. A hum, a ping, a boom. These aren't just noises, they're events. They can change your route, alter your mood, or keep you awake at night. And in a place where the landscape is already strange and mutable, they can convince you that the land itself is alive. For those who believe in the possibility of a hidden world at the pole, the unexplained Arctic sounds are more than curiosities, they're messages. Not messages in the sense of language, but in the sense that the environment is signalling that something is there, moving, working, shifting in the deep places we cannot see. When the sound fades and the silence returns, you're left with the unsettling knowledge that the Arctic is never truly quiet. It's just waiting for the next moment to speak. The Arctic hum fades, leaving the ice still and silent, but its echo lingers in the imagination, and perhaps that is where it has always belonged, not just in the realm of science and exploration, but in the fertile ground where stories grow. If the Arctic is a stage, then popular fiction has been its most theatrical director, taking the bare bones of reality and dressing them in layers of invention, danger, and wonder. The authoritative fact: for at least 150 years, writers have used the North Pole as a canvas for their most ambitious fantasies. In 1864, Jules Verne published The Adventures of Captain Hatteras, imagining a voyage to the pole and a volcanic island at its very centre. The heat of the volcano keeps the surrounding waters ice-free, a concept not entirely removed from the idea of geothermal polar oases. Later, in 1915, Edgar Rice Burroughs at the Earth's core spun an entire adventure inside a hollow Earth, reachable through a polar opening. These were not scientific treatises, they were entertainment. But like all good stories, they borrowed just enough from reality to make the impossible feel plausible. The odd fact, even before Verne, there were 19th century travel narratives that presented polar fictions as if they were genuine reports. These included forged journals of explorers who claimed to have found temperate lands beyond the ice. One of the most infamous was Jeremiah N. Reynolds' 1836 lecture tour across the United States, in which he passionately argued for a hollow Earth and urged the government to send an expedition. His speeches were so persuasive that they inspired both political lobbying and literary works, blurring the line between advocacy and storytelling. Hypothesis time. Could the popularity of such tales have influenced real exploration? The relationship between fiction and expedition is more intertwined than we might think. Polar explorers grew up reading adventure novels, and sometimes those fictional maps became mental overlays on the real Arctic. In a few cases, ships were named after fictional vessels. In others, captains carried novels in their ship libraries. It's not hard to imagine how a vivid fictional account of a warm polar basin might make a navigator more attentive to a sudden shift in ice or temperature. Historians are still debating the cultural impact of Jules Verne's polar fiction in particular. His detailed, quasi-scientific descriptions, complete with invented latitude and longitude coordinates, made readers feel as though the stories were anchored in genuine geography. This stylistic choice set a precedent for later authors, including H.P. Lovecraft, whose 1931 novella At the Mountains of Madness relocated the hidden world to Antarctica, but borrowed heavily from polar expedition reports. In Lovecraft's telling, ancient alien ruins lay under the ice, accessible only through perilous mountain passes. For readers unfamiliar with polar landscapes, the setting felt not just fantastical, but possible. Picture it. You're a reader in the late 19th century, the lamp on your desk flickering as a storm rattles the windows. You open a serialized adventure in a magazine and read of an icebreaker pushing through pack ice under a sky lit by the aurora. The hero and his crew find open sea where none should be, sail into it, and discover a land teeming with prehistoric animals and strange civilizations. When you close the magazine, the wind outside sounds different, as if it's carrying a message from somewhere far beyond the known world. An odd detour into cinema. In 1959, Walt Disney Productions released The Journey to the Center of the Earth, loosely based on Verne's novel, but adding its own fantastical interpretations. Though the film set most of its action underground, it reinforced the visual vocabulary of the hidden world. Lush valleys under a glowing sky, waterfalls cascading into endless chasms, imagery that would later seep into depictions of polar paradises. By the late 20th century, films like The Thing, 1982, and the X-Files episode set in the Arctic further cemented the idea that the poles hide something extraordinary, whether ancient civilizations or alien life. Fiction did more than dramatize. It stitched together disparate threads, real expeditionary hardships, scientific anomalies, indigenous legends, into coherent, compelling myths. Where explorers' journals might mention a sudden warm wind or a mirage, fiction turned it into a portal. Where Inuit oral history spoke of lands beyond the ice, fiction populated them with lost tribes, dinosaurs, or mechanical wonders. Over time, these embellishments became so familiar that they almost felt like part of the original record. Fringe researchers sometimes cite fictional works as if they were coded truths, arguing that certain authors must have known something, or were inspired by suppressed reports. While there's no evidence for such direct connections, the notion persists because fiction often precedes discovery. After all, submarines, helicopters, and even space travel appeared in literature long before they became reality. So why not a warm world at the pole? Historians who study the interplay between literature and exploration note that fictional accounts can subtly shape public perception of what's worth funding. A public enthralled by polar adventures is more likely to support real expeditions, and a culture primed for mystery is more likely to see anomalies as clues rather than errors. In this sense, fiction hasn't just described the myth of the lost Arctic world, it has actively sustained it. Let's imagine, for a moment, a fictional Arctic scene. A vessel trapped in ice at 82 degrees north. The captain scans the horizon through his spyglass and sees a distant cliff, green at its base, steam rising from vents along its face. The crew is restless, whispering of land unseen by modern eyes. They push across the ice toward it, but as they draw near, the cliff dissolves into mist, a mirage, or perhaps a vision. Back at port, the captain writes it down, not in his official log, but in a letter to a friend who writes novels. Months later, the scene appears in print, stripped of its ambiguity, presented as pure adventure. And so, the legend grows. Even today, fiction continues to feed the myth. Science fiction novels, video games, and films set in the Arctic often use the same tropes. An isolated crew, strange lights in the sky, a hidden landscape revealed only under rare conditions. Each new story layers another coat of plausibility on the idea that somewhere, beyond the last charted ridge of ice, there's something waiting. And maybe that's the real power of popular fiction. It doesn't just imagine the hidden world, it trains us to expect it. So when a strange sound echoes under the ice, when a warm wind blows in midwinter, or when a map shows a curious blank, we already have the language to describe it. We call it the gateway, the oasis, the inner realm. We call it the place where the story becomes real. The romance of polar fiction might have begun in the flicker of candlelight and the turning of paper pages, but the modern age replaced hand-drawn maps with something far more powerful, the eye in the sky. And yet, for all its precision, satellite imagery has not killed the legend of a hidden Arctic world. In some ways, it has deepened it. Because in a world that promises to show you everything, what it doesn't show becomes far more interesting. The authoritative fact is this. Since the mid-1960s, Earth observation satellites have captured millions of high-resolution images of our planet's surface. NASA's first meteorological satellites, like TIROS-1, could barely make out continents. Today, commercial satellites can photograph a car in a driveway from hundreds of kilometers above. And yet, if you open a public mapping service and scroll toward the very top of the globe, you'll notice something odd. At the precise location of the geographic North Pole, the imagery often blurs, distorts, or disappears entirely, replaced by a uniform grey, white, or even black patch. The odd fact: this phenomenon isn't consistent. Sometimes the gap is circular, sometimes diamond-shaped, sometimes stretched by map projections into a smear. Depending on which mapping platform you use, the North Pole may look like a clean white ice cap, a fuzzy gradient, or a gaping hole. In truth, the variation often comes from the challenges of stitching satellite images over a converging longitude grid. But the irregularity is enough to raise eyebrows among those already inclined to suspect concealment. A hypothesis naturally follows. Could these anomalies be more than technical artifacts? For decades, conspiracy theories have suggested that certain areas of the polar regions, both north and south, are deliberately obscured. The stated reasons vary wildly: to hide military installations, to conceal evidence of climate change effects, or to protect knowledge of vast entrances into an inner Earth. Proponents of the Lost World hypothesis point to the way certain satellite swaths seem to avoid the exact pole, claiming this is a deliberate omission rather than an accident of orbital geometry. Historians are still debating how much of this is deliberate censorship and how much is simply the result of mapping mathematics. The poles present unique problems for satellite imaging because orbital paths and camera angles distort terrain near the convergence point. In some cases, the whole is literally a gap where no satellite has passed directly overhead at a suitable angle to capture usable imagery. In others, it's a quirk of how two-dimensional map projections handle the three-dimensional globe. But there's something undeniably alluring about those gaps. The human mind is wired to fill in blanks, and when the blank is at the top of the world, we tend to fill it with something dramatic. We can't help but imagine that if we could just peel back that blurred patch, we'd see more than ice, perhaps an expanse of green, a hidden ocean, or even the edge of a cavern leading downward. Let's play with a visual. Imagine you're zooming in on a satellite map late at night. The room is dark, the only light coming from your screen. You scroll higher and higher past the familiar continents, over the pale ice cap until the map glitches. The colours smear, the clarity vanishes, and suddenly you're staring at a perfect circle of nothing. No texture, no shadow, no feature, just absence. Your cursor hovers there as if pressing too hard might push you through to the other side. In the late 20th century, before high-speed internet made such images common, polar research still relied heavily on government-released photographs. Some of the earliest images of the Arctic from space came from the Apollo missions, where astronauts reported seeing unusual atmospheric phenomena over the poles. While officially dismissed as optical effects, the accounts have been recycled in online forums as possible glimpses of polar openings. The fact that these images were often grainy or taken at oblique angles didn't diminish their appeal. In fact, it enhanced it, much as the fuzziness of an old black and white photo can make a ghost story more believable. Oddly enough, this isn't the first time that cartographic absence has stirred speculation. Medieval maps often left uncharted areas blank or filled them with monsters, decorative scrollwork, or vague inscriptions like Hic sunt dracones. Here be dragons. In a way, the pixelated patch at the North Pole is the digital equivalent of that medieval uncertainty. It's an invitation to imagine. Fringe researchers sometimes take this further by pointing to a handful of anomalous satellite images from the 1960s through the 1980s that appear to show darker, ice-free areas near the pole. Most of these, when analysed, turn out to be shadows, melt ponds, or imaging errors. But in the logic of mystery, each debunking only serves to suggest that there's something worth hiding. Even more curious are the stories from amateur radio operators in the 1970s and 1980s who claim to have intercepted unusual signals originating from high latitudes. Signals that didn't correspond to known satellites or stations. Could they have been picking up transmissions from a hidden polar facility? Or, if one follows the Hollow Earth narrative, from deep within the planet itself? The practical explanation is more mundane. Atmospheric conditions can bend and reflect radio waves, making them seem to originate from unexpected locations. But the allure of a secret polar broadcaster remains irresistible to some. Today, with the rise of open-source intelligence, the ability to cross-reference imagery from multiple providers has increased, and yet certain Arctic zones still appear stubbornly blank or outdated on public platforms. The explanation often lies in economics. It costs money to task satellites to photograph remote, uninhabited ice fields, and companies focus on more populated or commercially relevant areas. But when the human mind encounters a blank, it tends to invent a reason. Let's imagine a scene that could come straight from a modern thriller. A data analyst at a mapping company notices that the same patch of Arctic ice is missing from 3 separate satellite datasets. Intrigued, she digs deeper, finding older imagery that shows a faint circular depression in the same location. The files are flagged, then disappear from her database overnight. She's told it's a routine data update, but she can't shake the feeling that someone didn't want her to see what was there. In truth, the Arctic has been home to classified installations before: Cold War listening posts, submarine rendezvous points under the ice, and even nuclear-powered research stations. It's entirely plausible that some of the missing imagery covers sensitive infrastructure. The irony is that this mundane secrecy feeds directly into the wilder theories, reinforcing the belief that something much stranger must be hidden there. And so the legend survives in the satellite age, transformed but intact, The old sea monsters have become pixelated holes. The uncharted waters have become GPS dead zones. We tell ourselves that technology can see everything, but our maps still have edges. And it is at those edges that stories take root. Perhaps one day a high-resolution, continuous mosaic of the Arctic will be published without a single gap. And perhaps, when that day comes, the legend of the lost world at the North Pole will fade. But more likely the believers will say the images have been altered, that the truth was edited out before it ever reached us. Because in the end, the map is not the territory, and the imagination will always find a way to see more than the pixels reveal. If there is one thing that keeps the legend of a hidden Arctic world alive more than maps or blurry pixels, it's stories. Maps can be explained away by technical glitches, but a human voice speaking with conviction about what it has seen has a different weight. Even when you know there's a chance they're mistaken or embellishing, the detail in such accounts is hard to shake. You can close a web browser, but it's harder to close the mental image someone's words have planted. The authoritative fact, over the last century, polar expeditions, both official and private, have recorded countless observations in logbooks, radio transcripts, and personal memoirs. While most describe nothing more extraordinary than ice, wind, and cold beyond imagining, a few stand out for their strange, almost impossible descriptions. These accounts, rare as they are, have become the bedrock of the lost world at the North Pole narrative. One of the most famous and controversial comes from a man named Admiral Richard E. Byrd, the American naval officer known for his pioneering flights over both poles. Official records show that Byrd's 1926 Arctic flight reached a point near the North Pole, and in 1947 he famously led an Antarctic operation called High Jump. But the odd fact, the one that fuels speculation, is an alleged secret diary in which Byrd supposedly wrote of flying over a lush green valley within the Arctic Circle, inhabited by advanced beings. The diary, as it's usually presented online, is almost certainly a hoax. It emerged decades after Byrd's death, without verifiable provenance. And yet, its imagery is irresistible. Vast forests under a warm sun, rivers cutting through ice, and cities of impossible architecture, hidden from the surface world. Historians are still debating whether Byrd's real logs might contain any ambiguous passages that could have sparked the legend. His official reports make no mention of tropical valleys or subterranean civilizations. Still, his fame, combined with the secrecy surrounding some of his military missions, has allowed the myth to attach itself to his name like frost clinging to metal. But Byrd's is not the only story. In the mid-20th century, a handful of Soviet pilots stationed in the far north reported unusual mirages, visions of land where there should be only ice. Some dismissed these as fata morgana, an optical phenomenon in which layers of warm and cold air bend light, making distant objects appear to float, stretch, or invert. A ship on the horizon might look like a city in the clouds, an ice ridge might become a green hill. Yet a hypothesis arises. Could these mirages be refracting light from something real, perhaps an ice-free interior region at high latitude? A particularly intriguing account came from a Canadian bush pilot in the 1970s, who claimed to have flown beyond the magnetic north and found his instruments behaving erratically. The compass spun uselessly, and radio contact faded. For nearly an hour he navigated by sight alone, following what he thought was a break in the cloud cover. Below him, he reported seeing dark water and patches of green land before turning back, shaken. Aviation experts later suggested he might have encountered a lead, a long crack in the sea ice exposing open water, and misinterpreted it from the air. But to believers, the detail about the instruments failing fits neatly with the idea of some hidden magnetic anomaly. Of course, not all accounts come from pilots. Some are whispered by sailors, men who have spent years in the high latitudes where silence is a constant companion. In the 1950s, a Norwegian fishing crew claimed to have been blown far off course during a storm, only to find themselves in a calm sea surrounded by land they couldn't identify. The cliffs were sheer and black, the air strangely warm. They anchored for a few hours before deciding to leave, fearing they had drifted into restricted Soviet waters. When they tried to retrace their route later, the currents and ice made it impossible. Officially, their charts recorded only unverified land sighting. The odd fact in these maritime tales is that unexplored islands do, from time to time, appear and disappear in the Arctic due to shifting ice, volcanic activity, or simple cartographic error. One famous case is Crocker Land, a landmass supposedly seen by explorer Robert Peary in 1906. Later expeditions found nothing, only ice and mirage, and yet the very existence of phantom islands in the historical record gives fuel to the possibility that something could be hidden, even now. The tension between ordinary explanation and extraordinary possibility is what makes these stories endure. Even the most mundane cause, a navigational error, a play of light, cannot fully erase the image of a pilot staring down at green where only white should be. In the last few decades, a new class of witnesses emerged. Scientists, glaciologists, geologists, and climate researchers working in the Arctic sometimes describe strange, localized climate anomalies, pockets of unexpectedly warm air, unusual wind patterns, or melt zones that persist longer than models predict. The mainstream explanation involves shifting currents, heat from undersea volcanic activity, or the complex dance of atmospheric systems in a changing climate. Yet for those inclined toward the Lost World theory, such anomalies are taken as modern, instrument-recorded proof that something unusual is stirring under the ice. And then there are the classified accounts, the ones we only hear about second-hand, through leaks, memoirs, or rumours. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union maintained ice stations and nuclear-powered submarines in the high Arctic. Crews rotated in and out, often under strict orders not to discuss their missions. Every so often, a retired sailor or intelligence officer will hint, in an interview or self-published memoir, about things seen under the ice, or waters warmer than they should be. It's almost impossible to verify such claims, but they thread themselves neatly into the existing tapestry of polar mystery. Consider the hypothetical, because this is where the mind wanders late at night, of a submarine cruising under the Arctic ice cap. It's moving silently through frigid water when suddenly the sonar shows an opening above, far larger than any polynya, a natural ice gap, should be. The commander rises toward it, the ice thinning overhead, and then breaks through into a circular lake surrounded by towering ice cliffs. Perhaps they take photographs, perhaps not. Perhaps those images are now sitting in a classified archive somewhere, the location carefully removed from the metadata. It's no surprise. The modern documentaries and speculative books about polar mysteries lean heavily on these first-person narratives. They're compelling because they're human. They remind you that, beyond the theories and the grainy maps, someone once stood, or flew, there and felt the shock of seeing something that shouldn't exist. Skeptics will argue, reasonably, that human perception is fallible, especially in extreme environments. Fatigue, cold, and stress can alter memory. Whiteouts erase the horizon, making distances and shapes deceptive. Mirages can stack the impossible into the sky. Yet none of that prevents the persistence of the stories, because each retelling gains a little more polish, a little more detail, until the line between lived experience and imagination blurs. And perhaps that's the heart of it. The lost world at the North Pole exists, if nowhere else, in the minds of those who believe they've seen it. Each account, whether born of truth, error, or invention, is a doorway. And like any good doorway, it beckons you to wonder what might lie beyond. The thing about mysteries, real or imagined, is that they rarely end cleanly. They fray at the edges. They dissolve into smaller questions that lead you in circles until you're not sure where you began. The North Pole, that perfect geometric point of the Earth's axis, is itself an abstraction. It doesn't exist as a physical stake in the ice. The ice moves, the seas shift, and the pole is always a few meters away from where you last placed it. So perhaps it's fitting that any story about what might lie beneath it should be equally hard to pin down. We've walked through maps with blank spots, through logs filled with ambiguous descriptions, through pilots' accounts of green valleys and sailors' tales of warm water coves. We've looked at anomalies in climate data and the slow drip of possible leaks from military archives. And now, as we draw close to the end, the most unsettling realization is this. None of it, none of the gaps, the errors, or even the myths can be dismissed entirely. The Arctic keeps its secrets because it is designed to do so. The authoritative fact, the central Arctic Ocean is among the least explored regions on Earth. Even in the 21st century, satellites struggle to capture detailed imagery beneath thick, shifting ice. Autonomous underwater vehicles can only operate for limited durations, and manned expeditions are rare and costly. The harshness of the environment is its own gatekeeper. And in human history, whenever a place resists full observation, myths move in to fill the void. Consider this odd fact. The Arctic ice cap is not static. It is a migrating, ever-changing entity. Each winter, it spreads. Each summer, it contracts. In some places, ridges as tall as buildings can form overnight, while elsewhere, thin ice gives way to open water in hours. If you were determined to hide something, an entrance, a structure, even a stretch of ice-free sea, this constant reshaping would be your best ally. From here, the hypotheses multiply. Some imagine a massive, naturally formed polar opening leading to an interior world, a relic of an earlier Earth when the poles were warm. Others shift the entrance beneath the sea, to vents or sinkholes in the ocean floor that lead not into a hollow world, but into deep, thermally active chambers. And there are those who suggest the lost world is no world at all, but a network of human-made facilities, built during the Cold War and abandoned, or perhaps still in quiet use. Historians are still debating whether our ancestors in the age of exploration truly believed in polar openings. Some point to 17th and 18th century maps with curious circular seas at the top of the world. Others argue these were simply cartographic guesses based on incomplete data. Either way, the visual motif, a hole at the pole, has persisted for centuries, sliding from medieval speculation to pulp magazine covers to YouTube thumbnails. We cannot ignore that, in recent decades, Arctic geopolitics has intensified. Russia, Canada, Denmark, Norway, and the United States all have competing territorial claims over parts of the Arctic seabed, not for its myths, but for its resources. Oil, gas, rare earth minerals, all lie beneath the ice, along with rich fisheries. Yet the public focus on these tangible assets doesn't erase the cultural pull of something stranger lying just out of sight. If anything, the secrecy surrounding military and industrial Arctic operations only fuels suspicion. In some sense, the North Pole has become a mirror. What you see there depends on what you bring to it. A scientist sees shifting albedo and climate feedback loops. A shipping executive sees a future of ice-free trade routes. A conspiracy theorist sees a doorway to another realm. And the rest of us, lying awake in the dark, see a question mark stamped onto the top of the globe. There's a personal element to this too. When you think of the North Pole, you're probably not picturing a GPS coordinate. You're picturing the end of the world in the old sense of the phrase, the place where the map runs out. And when the map runs out, we are left with stories. Some of these stories will fade as technology improves. High-resolution satellite imagery will close certain gaps. Autonomous drones will chart the under-ice seabed. But in the same way that the moon still has a far side, there will always be angles and moments when the Arctic remains unobserved. There will always be a window for mystery to slip through. And maybe that's the real lost world. Not a lush valley under a full sun, but the space in our minds that refuses to settle for the simplest explanation. The human need to imagine something more, something hidden, something waiting. The North Pole offers the perfect stage for that desire, because it is both there and not there, an ever-moving point atop a shifting, melting, reforming world of ice. If you were to stand there on that drifting ice, the compass needle wavering, the cold seeping through your boots, you would feel it. The sense that under the surface, under the ice and the sea and the bedrock, something ancient is keeping its own counsel. That it has been here long before us and will remain long after. You might think about the explorers who came before, who risked everything for a glimpse of the unknown. You might think about the sailors who swore they saw green hills, the pilots who swore they flew over warm rivers, the scientists who recorded anomalies they couldn't explain. And you might realize that, regardless of what's physically there, the lost world at the North Pole is already real because it exists in the collective imagination of everyone who's ever wondered. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Now we slow down. The questions can wait. The ice drifts, as it always has, and the pole continues its quiet dance atop the earth. Whatever you believe, whether it's just ice and sea or something far stranger, the Arctic will still be there when you wake. The storms will come and go, the ice will crack and heal, the sky will turn its pale blue, then gold, then the long, slow darkness of polar night. Let the images soften now, the cold wind fading to a whisper, the snow settling in a perfect white sheet over every trace of your footsteps. The horizon blurs until it's impossible to tell where the ice ends and the sky begins. Even the compass needle has stopped its restless twitch, as if it too is ready to rest. Somewhere far beneath you, whether in your imagination or in reality, the lost world sleeps. Perhaps it dreams of the time before ice, or of a time to come when the surface world will finally find it. Or perhaps it dreams of nothing at all. You don't need to decide tonight. You don't need to prove or disprove anything. You can let the uncertainty remain, like a candle that burns quietly in the corner of a dark room, casting just enough light to keep the shadows interesting. Your breathing slows. Your eyes grow heavy. The world of questions and maps and shifting ice tilts gently away, and you follow it into the slow drift of sleep. Somewhere beyond the reach of any ship or plane, the pole waits, and the mystery waits with it. Good night.